Okay, well, I'm going to kick off, and I'm sure people will slowly join us, but I'll start with some introductions and things. So welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited to hear Kate's talk today. So Dr. Kate Gibson is a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at the University of Manchester and Centre for Research Collections Fellow at the University of Edinburgh. Her first book, Illegitimacy, Family and Stigma in 18th Century England, will be published by the OUP in 2022. And she's written extensively on the history of the family, the history of marriage, extramarital sex and illegitimacy. Her work is featured in History Today and BBC Radio 4. Her next project, Looked After Children, Fostering and Adoption in Britain 1700 to 1839, is a history of childcare, fostering and adoption in 18th century Britain, which sounds absolutely fascinating. Okay, so without too much further ado, oh, Oregon in the USA as well, that's fabulous. And we've got a far-flung audience today for you. So I will hand over to you, Kate, and looking forward to it.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for coming, especially from different time zones and continents, which is quite nice. So I'm sure that many of you will be familiar with the Foundling Hospital and the way it operated. We know from the petitions that were sent to the hospital that many of the children were illegitimate and that many were left with the hospital because of the difficulties faced by unmarried parents and the social and economic penalties attached to illegitimacy, as well as poverty. The vast majority of illegitimate children, though, were not abandoned or raised in institutions, but were cared for by families in the community, and it's these children that I'm going to talk about today. This will hopefully give you some context on why parents left children with the hospital and on the more general experiences of illegitimate children in this period. I'd like to flag just before we start that I'm going to be quoting directly from 18th and 19th century sources, some of which use derogatory language about children, and this language can be distressing. So if you need to leave the Zoom at any point, or if you'd like to talk to me about this afterwards, then please do so. The cases that I'm going to talk about today were part of my PhD research, and they'll be in my forthcoming book, Illegitimacy, Family and Stigma in England, which is going to be out in the autumn, which is quite exciting. So I wanted to find out what it was like to be illegitimate in the 18th century and what effect it had on a person's life, on their relationships with parents and family, on their education, occupation and marriage chances, and on their sense of self and identity. So in this larger project in the book, I compared the experiences of children from across the whole social scale, so from the very poor to elites. And I'm happy to talk about any of these other themes in the questions, but today I'm going to focus mainly on the experience of the labouring poor. So not only were they the majority of the population, but they were also most likely to consider leaving their children with the Foundling Hospital. I looked for evidence of illegitimate experience in autobiographies, diaries and letters, particularly what are called pauper letters. So these were letters written by the labouring poor to the overseers of their parish asking for relief. And this was a widespread process under the old poor law. So that's the welfare system in England up until 1834. And these letters are particularly fascinating for historians because they not only reveal the actual words of a section of the population who exist in very few other sources, but they also detail the lives of illegitimate children in families rather than in state or charity institutions. And they show these kind of negotiations between the family and the state. And the other sources that I'm using, so mainly autobiographies, provide vital evidence of family attitudes towards illegitimate children, as well as the feelings of illegitimate individuals themselves. So what do we mean by illegitimacy in this period? So illegitimacy refers to children who were born to parents who were not married to each other. They could be married to someone else, and that's a whole other thing. Illegitimate individuals have been legally discriminated against for hundreds of years and in many different societies across the world. This discrimination existed to control female sexuality and reproduction and to ensure the orderly inheritance of property and status down the male line. In an era before DNA testing, attaching stigma to illegitimacy theoretically encouraged births within marriage and allowed fathers to be as sure as they could be that a child was biologically theirs. So it's all about paternity, it's about controlling paternity. Various legal penalties were attached to illegitimate people in 18th century England. Legally, an illegitimate person had no father. So this meant that they had no right to inheritance, so of property, name, or settlement. So that's to entitle you to poor relief. They did have some settlement, but it worked differently, and I'll talk about that later. So they were a kind of legal non-entity in a period when your birth and your family relationships, especially your father and paternal family, were very important in determining your social and economic status and your position in the community. And illegitimacy in England was lifelong and unchanging. There was nothing an individual could do about it. And England was actually unusual within Europe that you couldn't be retroactively legitimated. If you were born illegitimate, that was it. For life. This was partially reformed in 1926, but the illegitimacy laws were only fully repealed in 1987, which is scandalously recently, really. The first thing to note, though, is that illegitimacy was not particularly unusual, and it was increasing in the 18th century. So this graph shows the proportion of illegitimate births as a percentage of registered baptisms, and it was compiled in the 1970s by Peter Laslett and Carlo Oosteveen. And so here you can see the two red lines are the kind of big increase. So the 18th century, just one long increase in numbers. And by the peak in about 1805, it's 6% of baptisms. This is a massive underestimate. So this is only proportions of births that were registered as illegitimate. Lots of births were not registered at all, and illegitimate children were sometimes falsely registered as legitimate. So the real number will be much, much more. Lots of families have had illegitimate relatives across the social scale, and it was not confined to one particular social group. It was really common. A range of circumstances could lead to an illegitimate birth. Historians have done lots of demographic studies of illegitimacy and have found that the majority of children were born to two single people who were having sex during courtship with the intention of getting married. Sex before marriage was very common in the 18th century. So around a third of women were pregnant when they got married. So it was not at all shameful to have sex before marriage, and families and communities saw this as a normal part of courtship. So they intended to get married before the birth, but in some cases, clearly this didn't happen, perhaps because of the death or migration of one of the partners, or because of economic problems like someone losing their job that meant the couple couldn't afford to get married. Several historians argue that one reason why illegitimacy increased in the 18th century was because economic dislocation increased. So you get the beginnings of industrialization, lots of migration, and also lots of wars. England was at war for a lot of the 18th century, so you get men joining up and not coming back. So this is a very famous painting that the Family Museum actually hold by Hogarth, The March of the Guards to Finchley. And this perhaps alludes to this problem. So in the close-up, you can see a heavily pregnant woman and a soldier, and it's not clear as to whether they're married or not. There's no clue. So he could have been leaving her, and then she then gives birth to an illegitimate child. So what happened when an illegitimate child was born, and what were the options available to parents? The state did recognise parents' obligation to financially support an illegitimate child. A pregnant unmarried woman would be brought before the parish overseers, so that's the people responsible for administering poor relief payments, and questioned to reveal the name of the father in a process called filiation. And that's what's happening here in this Thomas Rowlandson print. So here he's satirising the power of the pregnant woman to name a foolish squire, who's the red-faced man kneeling down, as the father of her child. The process could be intimidating, particularly if a woman, for whatever reason, didn't want to name the father, but it does emphasise that the parish saw both parents as responsible and supported the woman's right to assistance from the father. The overseers would then find the father and compel him to pay child maintenance, either as a lump sum or a weekly payment, and if he refused, he would be imprisoned. The money was intended to allow the mother to care for the child herself until the child turned 7, when they would be apprenticed out by the parish. So In theory, this was good because it respected the child's right to parental support and respected to some degree the bond between mother and child. And it also underlined in law that illegitimate children were entitled to some of the same ideals as a legitimate family, so provision and care from your parents. However, in practice, there were problems. We know from the financial accounts of several different parishes that many fathers, in some areas up to 40%, absconded or were jailed for non-payment of maintenance. So clearly, lots of fathers did not accept responsibility for their children. In some cases, this was because fathers were too poor and were unable rather than unwilling to pay. We have letters written by one unmarried father whose name was Henry Blomfield, and he was a gardener from Colchester in Essex. He was asked to pay £4 a year for his illegitimate child who was born in 1819. His payments of £1 per quarter were repeatedly late. As he told the overseers, he found it, quote, extremely hard to pay £4 out of the small wages of £10 per year. Blomfield was living hand to mouth. He was unable to pay until he received his quarterly wages, and at one point defaulted, having been, quote, out of situation for upwards of 2 months and being so unwell that I was unable to work. By 1821, he feared he must come to prison, for I am looked at with a severe face from those who have trusted me. I cannot pay them at the appointed time because of sending the money for this cursed bastard. Fathers like Blomfield were given the choice of paying and sinking deeper into poverty, or defaulting and being imprisoned. And so it is unsurprising that many fathers ran away and had no further contact with their child or the child's mother. Many historians have noted that a reputation for honesty, industry, and the avoidance of debt were significant parts of labouring masculinity in this period, all of which could be damaged by unmarried fatherhood and filiation. So many men associated their child with debt and loss of reputation, and therefore resented their paternity. Some fathers deliberately tried to avoid responsibility because they were ashamed or disputed their paternity. And this traded on a view of women in 18th century culture that characterized unmarried mothers as scheming and sexually dishonest. So here, for example, you've got a print again by Rowlandson, where the pregnant woman and her real lover, so that's the man sort of sniggering behind the door, are trying to dupe the older man on the right into thinking that the child is his, and the implication that women did this for money or to embarrass the older man in this situation and to escape the responsibility of parenthood. So this idea of cuckoldry, that a woman would deliberately lie about her child's paternity and force a man to take care of a child that was not his, was absolutely everywhere in 18th century culture. And it taps into a really deep-seated fear of female sexuality. And we can see this fear reflected in how people behaved in real life and in the ways that fathers viewed their children and the mothers of their children. So we've got a diary from a man called John Cannon, who was an excise officer living in Watlington in Oxfordshire in the early 18th century. And in it, he details his brief relationship with a maidservant, Anne Heister, who was working and living in the same household as him, where John was a lodger. Both of them were unmarried, so on paper, this is exactly the kind of relationship that characterized most unmarried parents. So between unmarried social equals that could be construed as courtship before marriage. John freely admitted having sex with Anne in his diary, so he was presumably aware that his paternity was possible. But when Anne got pregnant and named John as the father to the parish, he argued that she had falsely accused him. He deployed all the negative stereotypes of female sexuality, arguing that he had been, quote, drawn in and ensnared by Anne, who would use all ways and means with me till she was with child, in hopes to force me to marry her, which I never had any thought of. He presented himself as a victim of cuckoldry, shifting blame onto Anne by presenting her as calculating, rational, and in control of her own fertility, reflecting all these contemporary fears in 18th century culture about female sexual agency. And the ubiquity of this fear, I think, allowed men to justify abandoning children or refusing to pay on the grounds that the child was not theirs, even though clearly they could have been responsible. John was compelled to pay maintenance by the parish, but his own shame at being caught out as he saw it in an illegitimate pregnancy meant that he was extremely resentful of the child and ceased all contact with it. He never mentions the child's name in his diary, and when the baby died from smallpox at the age of 4, he expressed his relief at, quote, the brat's death, and that this job of journey work, for so it might be called, being as before so basely imposed on me, cost me first and last about £40. He saw the child as a reminder of his past follies and filthy sin of fornication, and the cause of both hurt to my soul and charge of my pocket. So where did this leave mothers? As we have seen, paternal maintenance payments were often late or disputed, and even when they were paid, the amount was usually not enough to allow mothers to look after their children full time. Most mothers cobbled together enough income through a mixture of parish relief, their own employment, and family support. Historians disagree on how supportive the parish was to unmarried mothers and their children. The filiation process, which compelled fathers to pay maintenance, was good in that it held both parents responsible, but by threatening imprisonment, it often created an antagonistic situation that didn't encourage fathers to stick around. Illegitimate children also had a slightly different entitlement to relief, known as settlement, which made their situation difficult. A person who could prove their settlement in a particular parish was entitled to relief from that parish and became that parish's responsibility. A legitimate child inherited settlement from their fathers, and wives shared settlements with husbands. So a legitimate nuclear family would all have the same settlement and be treated as one unit by the parish. Illegitimate children, because they legally had no father, so couldn't inherit anything, were settled in the parish in which they were born. An illegitimate child could therefore be settled in an entirely different parish to that of their mother, father, or any siblings, and this left them vulnerable to separation. A child living with their family in parish B could be sent back to their parish of settlement, parish A. Parishes were often flexible and could use their discretion to keep families together, but the threat of separation was always there. The difference in settlement rights could lead to the practice of removal, or sending pregnant women to other parishes to give birth in order to avoid financial responsibility for the child. And removal made it much more difficult to access family support. The diary of mill mechanic Benjamin Shaw from the early 19th century details the illegitimate pregnancies of his 3 daughters. Shaw and his daughters had lived in Preston for most of their lives, but they were settled in Dolphinholme, 18 miles away. His daughter Bella lived with her parents in Preston throughout her pregnancy in 1819, but was sent to Dolphinholme to actually give birth. So that ensures that Dolphinholme is responsible for the child, because Preston don't want the responsibility. And Preston refused to give her any assistance. She then gave birth and returned home only 12 days afterwards, suggesting a strong desire to return to her family, because she had to give birth in lodgings far away from anybody. Poor married mothers, in contrast, could give birth and get relief from their husband's place of settlement. The wife of Bella's brother Thomas gave birth in Preston in the family home surrounded by her husband's relatives. Several historians have shown that unmarried women often gave birth alone, but we need to remember that this wasn't necessarily because their family refused to support them, but more likely that they were unable because of the restrictions of settlement and poor relief. So settlement laws restricted families' ability to help, and to a certain extent reinforced a sense that illegitimate children were not part of the community. But conversely, when a child was settled in that parish, they had a very strong right to relief, and the parish almost always supported them. Some parishes were flexible and pragmatic and tried to keep mothers and children together. So I looked at the early 18th century parish of St Margaret's in Westminster, which has really well preserved nursing lists. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture of that particular list, but this is a similar one from later in the century. So the nursing lists show that some parishes paid mothers to nurse their own children, maintaining a mother-child relationship while cutting costs. So they're effectively providing employment for the mother at the same time as care for the child. So this was particularly economical if mothers had more than one child. So by 1717, Jane Jones had 2 children, Anne and Mary, by 2 fathers. The parish paid Jane to nurse both girls until Anne's death in 1718, when she continued to nurse Mary alone until 1721. Joanna Glynn was born in 1714, the illegitimate daughter of Joanna Pereira and gentleman Francis Glynn. She was immediately sent to a parish nurse, but returned to her mother when her illegitimate half-sister was born in 1715. In 1722, she was nursed out again, but in 1724, the parish apprenticed her to her own mother. Parish relief or family support was crucial because most unmarried mothers also had to work outside the home to support their children. The majority of work available to women was low paid, insecure, and part-time, as the British economy in this period was organised around the idea of a male breadwinner wage. So men got paid much, much more. It was very difficult for women to earn enough money to support a child on their own, and even more difficult to combine it with childcare. The most lucrative occupation open to women was domestic service. We know from demographic studies that the majority of unmarried mothers were domestic servants and continued to work as domestic servants after their child's birth. Service was well paid, and it included board and lodging, providing mothers with enough money to pay a foster parent or nurse to care for their child or to send money home to family carers. However, working in service separated mother and child. Employers rarely allowed servants to bring children into their household, either out of concern for the family's reputation or from practical difficulties of combining a servant's work with childcare. A servant's time and whereabouts was closely controlled by their employer, who could be unsympathetic. In 1825, Sarah Carden left her illegitimate child in Chelmsford Workhouse to enter service with a Mrs. Stapleton of Soho. The correspondence between Mrs. Stapleton and the workhouse master indicates a striking lack of understanding of maternal distress from a middling employer. According to Mrs. Stapleton, Sarah found separation from her child difficult. She was, quote, in a very desponding state about her child. She neither eats nor drinks. Sarah feared her child was ill, but had received no communication from the workhouse. Mrs. Stapleton continued, for my own part, I think if the child is ill, it will be better not to inform her of it, as it tends to make her unfit for anything. She also would then want to come down to see the child, for which purpose she does not possess any means at present. When Sarah returned to Chelmsford and gave up her job, Mrs. Stapleton accused her of a scandalous and ungrateful deception, and felt that it was a great pity that an otherwise clever servant should have paid so little regard to her welfare. Mrs. Stapleton could not understand Sarah's maternal distress, suggesting that she considered that poor unmarried mothers should prioritise economic rationality over the care of their children. But when we turn to the words of unmarried mothers themselves, they consistently portray themselves as good mothers, using language of provision, responsibility, and care, which was very similar to the language used by married mothers. Women asserted their maternal prerogative to know what was best for their child, even if they were physically absent. In 1824, the Chelmsford overseers boarded out Phoebe Joyce's 10-year-old illegitimate son, John, with a foster family, so that Phoebe could earn a living as a domestic servant. Despite her absence, Phoebe continued to stress her maternal rights. She complained that she did not personally know her son's foster mother and had heard that she was a woman of drunken habits. So a drunk, basically. She asserted, my intention is to do all in my power for my child. I do not want the parish to find him any clothes. I will furnish him with what he wants. Phoebe had to delegate her concerns to the parish overseers because her job meant that she had little agency over her time. She ended the letter, I cannot possibly come personally myself as my mistress is not at home. I and other historians such as Samantha Williams have found very little evidence that mothers experience shame or that illegitimacy caused any resentment of the child or a breakdown in the mother-child relationship. If mothers could get jobs, then care from grandparents, aunts and uncles was crucial. Parish studies from as far apart as London and the Scottish Highlands estimate that between 72% and 80% of illegitimate children lived with their maternal grandparents. And we can go back to the diary of Preston mechanic Benjamin Short for more evidence of this. When his daughter Bella became pregnant in 1819, Benjamin recorded that, quote, she continued to live with her parents who brought up the child until she was married in 1822. Although the father admitted paternity, a delay in obtaining maintenance payments until the child was 4 months old meant that Bella would have been destitute without parental assistance. Bella was not treated unusually. Her 3 sisters also lived at home during their illegitimate pregnancies, helped by the fact that all of them could get work in Preston's textile factories and could earn money for the entire household while their children were cared for by grandparents. If grandparental care was no longer possible, aunts and uncles stepped in. When his daughter Agnes died shortly after giving birth, Benjamin looked after his illegitimate granddaughter Betty alone until he was too ill to care for her. 4-year-old Betty then went to live with her married uncle Joseph, keeping her care within the maternal family. Many illegitimate children were also raised by stepfathers. 50 to 85% of mothers of illegitimate children went on to marry another man, providing a child with a stepfather and potential step-siblings. Marriage was crucial in keeping mothers and children together because a higher male wage could support the household while mothers cared for children. And we have lots of evidence from pauper letters written by stepfathers. And in these, stepfathers usually only asked for parish relief during times of particular hardship, suggesting that they had otherwise considered the children part of their responsibility. John Argent wrote to Chelmsford Parish in 1824 to ask for relief for his 6-year-old illegitimate stepdaughter, Mary, because I was not able to do what I would for her, being in ill health. So that implies he would normally be looking after her by himself. Mrs. Felgate first asked her home parish of St. Peter's, Colchester, for help in 1816 when her illegitimate daughter Mary was 6. She had just given birth to twins, putting the household under greater financial pressure. Their clergyman, George Turner, supported her request for relief as her husband, a Thatcher, was from the pressure of the times and want of employment, unable to support the child. Presumably, Mr. Felgate had been supporting Mary previously with no other parish assistance. After maintenance was granted, Mary continued to live with her stepfamily with no other problems. When she was 14, Turner stated, "It is but justice to the mother and her husband to state that the girl has been put to school and very decently brought up. They applied for further support only when Mary was a teenager and required a place in service, and her parents' ability to help her was limited by their own large family." In all of these cases, the parish could have ordered the children to return to their parish of settlement, but they all opted to pay the families cash relief, known as out relief, and allow them to stay together. So far, I've painted a pretty rosy picture of families accepting illegitimate children supported by the parish. This was the case for many children at certain points in their lives, but family dynamics were not static, and attitudes could vary as children grew and families changed. We have lots of evidence from the diary and letters of Silas Neville, an aspiring physician, and the mother of his children, his housekeeper Sally Bradford. This relationship is slightly different to the ones I've mentioned so far, in that it was socially unequal and not intended as a precursor to marriage. Sally was a domestic servant from Eastbourne who already had one illegitimate child, Polly, when she was employed by the middle-class Silas in 1769. Sally moved with Silas to Norfolk, leaving her 3-year-old daughter Polly with her parents and sisters Jemima and Nan. By 1770, after Sally and Silas had started a sexual relationship, she convinced him to bring Polly into his household. Sally told her parents that she had married a Mr. Russell, who's entirely fictional, inventing a loving and respectable stepfather to convince them to send their granddaughter to her new home. Ideally, relationships between masters and servants and parents and children were based on authority, obedience, and love. Masters were meant to encourage their dependents to love them in the belief that love fostered obedience. But Polly's unusual position as neither a servant, nor a biological child, nor a legal child caused difficulties. In October 1770, Silas recorded in his diary, "Had a violent dispute with Sally about correcting her child, which she promised I should have the full power of doing before I consented to have her here." Silas seems to have tried to copy legitimate parent-child ideals of discipline and affection, noting the next month that, "I have taken much pain to make this little creature love me, but in vain." Domestic harmony was hard-won and slow to arrive. In June 1771, he recorded that Polly seems to love me pretty well now and is at least very obedient. And by October 1771, a year after she had arrived, he was satisfied that, "I feel an affection for both Sally and her child." However, Polly's position was precarious. When Silas moved the household to Edinburgh in 1772, he insisted on leaving Polly behind. After difficulty finding lodgings due to rumours that Sally was his mistress, which she was, he was unable to bring Polly and risk damaging his reputation in a new social circle. Polly was sent to foster parents in Norfolk and remained there until 1777, when they raised the price of her board and Silas refused to pay. Polly was then returned to her maternal family in Sussex, but her experience indicates the difficulty involved in accommodating an extra child whose demands shifted as they aged. When Polly had first lived with her maternal family, aged 3, she was well looked after in an extended household that included Sally's younger sisters, who acted as additional carers. After the move to Norfolk, Sally proudly described her in letters back home as one of the finest prattling girls ever was. She desires her love to her grandmama and her Aunt Mima and Aunt Nan. When Polly returned in 1777, the situation was very different. Now aged 11, her board was more expensive and inconvenient, and family circumstances had changed. Jemima had just given birth to her own illegitimate child, and Nan had married and moved away. So Polly was sent to live with her great uncle, who expected to be paid extra for the trouble. Sally asked her sister, "Do what you can to make my uncle take £0.50 a week. What does he ask 3 shillings for? For lodging it must be, which is monstrous, as I know my mother will find most of her victuals. I heartily wish you and my mother could contrive any way to take care of the child without him at all, and the money would be of great service to you." Maternal families did step in to care for illegitimate children when necessary, and indeed the Bradfords approached Polly's care as a joint effort, but their ability to do so was limited when they faced financial pressures and competing demands. Infants, like Jemima's newborn baby, were understandably prioritised over older children. Sally herself had to prioritise the care of her own younger children. She became increasingly financially dependent on Silas and gave birth to 3 more illegitimate children by him between 1775 and 1777. She was unable to visit Polly, and there is no evidence that they met again before Polly's death in 1778, aged 12. A factor that historians do not readily acknowledge is that when women gave birth to a second illegitimate child, they often had to stay with one child over another. So by her death at the very young age of 12, Polly had lived in households headed by her grandmother, her great uncle, her mother's lover/employer, and foster parents. And in all of these households, her position was conditional and temporary. So to bring it back to the Foundling Hospital, you can see that parents relied on an often precarious mixture of maternal employment, parish relief, and family support. And if one or all of these failed, then you can see how easily parents would see abandonment to the Foundling Hospital as the best option. So when we think about the reasons that children were abandoned, shame and the fear of stigma are not at the forefront of either parents' or children's accounts. Illegitimate children and their families had limited options due to practical structural issues in 18th century society, such as limited female employment options, a lack of childcare, and a society that was designed for 2-parent legitimate families. I want to spend just the remainder of the time focusing on the words of illegitimate children themselves. And there is compelling evidence that illegitimate individuals did not feel that they belonged in families, particularly in comparison with legitimate half-siblings. One of the best sources we have for the impact of illegitimacy on individuals is the autobiography of James Byrne, published as the autobiography of a beggar boy when James was 55. James was writing as part of a general trend for working class autobiography in the mid-19th century, and in it he's constructing a narrative that emphasises his triumph over adversity and his social mobility from poverty to industrious respectability. So he's creating a persona as well as writing truthfully about his life. So James was at first brought up primarily by his mother, a peddler, and his stepfather, William McNamee, a former soldier. Byrne depicted William as a father figure and mentor who had a significant positive impact on his early life, writing, "I owe him an eternal debt of gratitude for having left an indelible impression of the noblest aspiration of his mind upon my own." James and William did at points have a mutually fulfilling, loving relationship. As James wrote, "He not unfrequently evinced as much real affection for me as if I had been his own child." However, James's position weakened once his parents had their own children, suggesting that many parents prioritized younger legitimate offspring. As his younger legitimate brother Robert grew older, James found that, quote, "little hold I had upon McNamee's good graces seemed to be waning, and James began to be made the scapegoat for both Robert's sins and my own. As with the other children I've mentioned today, James's position in the household was precarious. Aged 12, he was sent to live with his biological father and stepmother, neither of whom he had met before. His father had deserted his mother before he was born, and James understandably resented this. He considered that my stepfather, with all his faults, on the whole had been a kind and not unfrequently an affectionate father to me. On the other hand, my own father was an utter stranger, and I went to him with my mind surcharged with a living hatred of his very name. James's father had not told his wife, James's new stepmother, about his existence, and this secrecy soured their relationship from the beginning. James wrote that she treated him, quote, with coldness and disdain, and that he felt like a complete stranger in my father's house. After living with them for a few months, he ran away and attempted to remake his self-identity, to distance himself from his illegitimacy and his father in particular. He changed his name from McBurney, so that's his father's surname, to Byrne, in order that I might sever the only remaining link that bound me to my family. I tore 2 syllables from my name, and thus I wandered forth into the wide world, a fugitive from kindred and from home. He viewed his name as symbolic of his illegitimacy, and by changing it could reinvent himself as an upwardly mobile family man, distanced from his illegitimate past, and as almost the antithesis of his parents. His autobiography emphasizes that he and his future wife did not engage in premarital sex, for example. They decided to marry without compromising her maiden delicacy, and when he had some vague idea that matrimony would be the only legitimate cure for falling in love, I made up my mind to merge the lover in the responsible character of a husband. He was determined that his children would not be illegitimate and married despite having not yet finished his apprenticeship. Byrne's response was not unusual. If you remember from earlier the story of Sally Bradford, who, as well as her daughter Polly, went on to have 3 illegitimate children with her employer Silas Neville. One of those children, Sarah, survived past infancy and was sent to a boarding school paid for by Silas. She never cohabited with either of her parents, and although she knew she was Sally's daughter, she didn't learn of Silas's identity until after his death when she was an adult. Sally wrote to her friend Reverend Howes of her resentment of Silas and her feelings of isolation and insecurity. She stated that when she discovered Silas's real identity, my poor little prospects were at that time nearly blighted by the depression of my spirits and the want of a kind friend to open my mind to. For long was I left entirely unnoticed. She focused on Silas's character flaws, what she called his folly and inconsistency, in order to present herself as the opposite. She wrote, "Though I cannot but lament being the offspring of such a parent, I am thankful that, though I am quite a dependent on the world, I have hitherto passed through life with so much respectability." She resolved to destroy all of her father's letters, quote, "for I am truly ashamed of them," a resolution that she apparently kept, unfortunately for historians, because I haven't been able to find them. Both James and Sarah's experience suggest that feelings of isolation and insecurity, the lack of dependable family, and particularly paternal support were the main negative impacts of illegitimacy. Secrecy and abandonment by family had a profound impact on children's sense of identity, and illegitimate children often felt a desire to distance themselves from parents, particularly if they wanted to succeed in the world. Both James and Sarah had ambitions to be respectable, and an illegitimate background was not compatible with this. However, neither of them internalized feelings of shame. Both James's published narrative and Sarah's private letters emphasize a belief in their own inherent worth and their potential. They were convinced they could succeed. And this belief in themselves could not be damaged by all the external cultural, social, and legal stigmas of illegitimacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. That was absolutely fascinating. We've actually already got a couple of questions in the chat, which is fantastic. So we've got a little bit of time for people to ask questions. So do just pop them into the chat box or into the Q&A. Either is fine. I'll find them. So we've got a couple of questions, and I was wondering, Virginia, I was wondering about the choice of abandoned in reference to children admitted into the Foundling Hospital. So it's really a question about the use of language. So, you know, if a mother can't afford to live, eat and take care of a child, can that really be described as abandonment? You know, just something, this is somebody who's writing a dissertation on the Foundling Hospital at the moment. So the language is tricky. So, you know, it's something we often talk about children who would otherwise have been abandoned. So I'm interested to hear what you've got to say about that.
Yeah, so I agree, yes. And I do think that we need to think about the language that we use. So I struggled for a long time about whether to use the word illegitimate, because it implies that the child is literally not a legal thing, which is incredibly disrespectful to a person. A person cannot be illegitimate, right? However, I absolutely refuse to use any other pejorative word, as the most other words describing that are pejorative. And so it's a balance between something that correctly kind of identifies the issue, but then is recognizable to the most people, and most people know what illegitimate means, which is why I use it. Abandonment, I use as a catch-all to include a whole host of reasons why a parent might no longer be in contact with her child, his or her child, it doesn't matter who abandoned. And I agree with you, abandonment does imply some level of choice, I suppose, when really we know from the vast majority of cases that this isn't really a choice. And if it is somehow a choice, it's between two very worst case scenarios. And I think we do need to be really understanding of the whole host of reasons why a parent might part with their child. I would probably still continue to use abandonment, just because historians need to agree on one particular word so that we can compare and continue to discuss it. But I would also kind of try and explain the nuances as to the background of it. That's not a very helpful answer. But I agree, language is really important.
That's actually a really interesting answer to hear, though, because it's something that we think about quite a lot. What that moment of sort of transferring care to the Foundling Hospital, what that actually is, what it looks like. Because I know there's a lot of discussion about, you know, there's the variety of circumstances, and we know there are mothers who leave tokens, leave information, they've had the child baptized, and there are some who leave nothing.
Yeah.
And, you know, you don't know exactly what the emotions are that are going on. It's quite hard to read.
And I think as well, we should consider abandonment as an act of care. Like, yes. it's not the opposite to care. And I think for many women, they thought, rightly or wrongly, as it turned out for that child's life, that they were doing the best thing, and that they were doing an act of motherhood, an act of care, in giving their children to the hospital.
So it's just about making clear that that's not a pejorative thing.
Yeah.
No, it is. It's tricky. I've got another question from Hilda. Was it difficult for women to prove who the father was?
So this is an interesting paradox of 18th century society, because on the one hand, the culture is very distrusting of women. Women have very little social and economic power. However, in the process of filiation, they have huge power in naming the father, because there's no DNA testing, there's no definitive proof. And so a lot of the time it went for one woman's word against a man's word. And unless the man could prove otherwise, the woman was trusted. Which really shows the kind of commitment to a child is the joint responsibility of two parents. So it's a funny paradox, but yes, they were able to prove it enough to get maintenance.
Gosh, that is interesting. Susan says, was infant mortality higher amongst illegitimate children? I'm wondering if the mothers received the same degree of birthing care as married mothers in comparable economic or social situations. I don't know if that's an area of expertise for you.
Yeah, so in terms of birthing care, so I am not an expert on medical history or the history of childbirth. A colleague of mine, Sarah Fox, has just written a really good book about giving birth. I think it's called Giving Birth in 18th Century England. So
I think that's right. Yeah.
Check that out. It's about the process of birth, and it's just been published. From what I can tell from my research, they did receive very similar standards of birthing care. they were entitled to, so a lot of poor women would enter the workhouse in order to give birth and then leave again. So it's like temporary medical care, and married and unmarried mothers use that equally. The only big difference is when I said about removal. So an unmarried woman could effectively be sent away across the parish boundary, and that would have the effect of separating her from her family, and she would have to give birth in lodgings. But I found lots of evidence of landladies, neighbours, like distant kin who lived somewhere else, helping. So there wasn't a sense that an unmarried mother was not deserving of medical help. In terms of infant mortality, yes, across the board, illegitimate children have higher infant mortality. And that is a really interesting statistic that can be seen. So I've seen it in studies of 18th century Iceland, 18th century England, 20th century England. It seems to be an almost historical constant. And there are several reasons for this. This could be that, so illegitimate children were much more likely to be firstborn children, and firstborn mothers had a higher rate of complication. So that would impact on the health of mother and child. There's two other reasons. So the other one is that if it's your firstborn, you're more likely to be younger. You're more likely, if you're poor, you're more likely to have an illegitimate child. And if you're poor, you're more likely to have other health conditions, malnourishment. If you're unmarried, you're more likely to work in quite heavy labour up until the birth of your child. So if you're a domestic servant, you're carrying coal upstairs, you're doing the washing. And if you're unmarried, you have less kind of family support around you, or you might have been keeping the pregnancy secret. So you're perhaps not looking after your health as much as a married woman might be who was on, say, her third or fourth child. And then the other one is that, you know how I said that mothers and children were likely to be separated if the mother went back out to service. So she's less likely to breastfeed. And as we know now, breastfeeding has a whole host of benefits health-wise, and also in the past, they didn't have the great formula milk that we have now and the clean water and all this kind of stuff and cow's milk. There was no formula. So there's not really a healthy alternative to breast milk in this period. So that could have affected babies' immune systems. So it's not neglect necessarily. I think this is what historians were perhaps looking at. Do illegitimate children die because they're being neglected? And it's not straightforward, that relationship.
So JL has a question. When we say sex before marriage was common, were people almost seen as kind of unmarriageable if they didn't? Knowing that having illegitimate children will bring on so many practical issues, would women still be pressured into sex with the hope for marriage rather than it being a real choice? I mean, was it kind of seen as a step on the road to marriage?
Well, so we have tricky evidence about this. We don't have very much evidence about how couples started relationships unless it ended badly, unfortunately. So a lot of the information we have is that when women were proving that this person was the father of their child, they effectively gave corroborating evidence. So we have depositions from people saying, from women saying, we were servants in the same household and we used to go out for walks, and then we had sex in this room at this time while our employers were out. And I thought we were going to get married. And they go into a fair amount of detail. And it seems like that sex was like a stage in the courtship process. And it was about, love and lust. They wanted to have sex with each other, humans do. But it was like a kind of natural progression on the journey from meeting someone and marrying them. I'm sure there was pressure from partners to have sex, but evidence of that is very rare. Equally, I'm sure there was considerable exploitation and sexual harassment and assault, but again, evidence is relatively hard to come by. But I think the thing that I want to underline is that the parents of unmarried children were not deviant in any way. They were engaging in completely normal, socially acceptable behavior in having sex before they got married, and it's just something interrupted the process effectively.
Mm. So we have a comment that, you know, this is still something that can be a difficulty today. Sometimes you wonder how far we've come even now when single parents continue to struggle to receive support from the other parent. I think fair comment, you know, I think that's one of the things that we find. We often think about the sort of parallels. You imagine that there will have been so much progress, but often in the museum's work, we try and draw parallels with contemporary issues, you know, and they're often surprisingly still very pertinent, I think it'd be fair to say. Was adoption used much to help legitimize illegitimate children? The questions are coming thick and fast.
Yeah.
People have got really interested in this one.
So adoption isn't a concept really until the 19th century. So there's no legal adoption or legal fostering. There's no state-sponsored fostering in the same way. Happens kind of through the poor law, but it's not called adoption. It's not the same as we would understand it now. Before the middle of the 19th century and widely 20th century. So no, in the way that we would think about it now. There's also a sense that, so in the 20th century, you get a lot of examples where children's origins and their illegitimacy is completely falsified. And they are, so a lot of you know, it was a plot in EastEnders at one point, a child being brought up by their grandparents in the belief that they're their parents and that their sister, they think is their sister, but is actually their mother. That's really common in the 20th century. And we've got lots of oral history and there's lots more kind of documentary evidence of it in the 20th century. I have found no examples whatsoever in the 18th or 19th centuries. And I think, and lots of other historians think, that that's because the shame of illegitimacy increased in the late 19th and 20th century. So secrecy was much more of a thing. Whereas in the 18th century, illegitimacy is known. You can't get away from it really. I have cases where children's illegitimacy is falsified. They give a false name and legitimacy on the birth record, but it always fails and they always get found out because illegitimacy law was all pervasive. It affected so many things. You had to prove it at different points in your life. So it's very hard to falsify. However, if we think about adoption and legitimizing a child in terms of giving them a nuclear family and a stable family life and two parents who cohabit, then when I was talking about stepfathers, that I suppose is a kind of adoption and a kind of legitimizing, because they do take that child on as part of their household and they take financial responsibility for them, and in many cases, you know, develop really strong emotional relationships with them. So yes, but informally and not in the way that we would do it now.
We might have to draw to a close soon, but I've got a couple more. So Christine says overseers could pay mothers to care for their child until they were about 7 or so, but after that they might board the child out so that the mother could work. How long historically did that practice continue?
So it has continued in some form or another until now. Boarding out and fostering are very similar. They just didn't have the word, they didn't really use the word fostering then. So boarding out completely, we know, was normal until 1834 when the poor law changed, got the new poor law. After that, it was much more common to have workhouses. So children, instead of being boarded out, would be sent to the workhouse or sent to a foster family or a nurse, depending on their age, nurses if they're infants. So it didn't end, it just morphed into something else, basically. And it's fostering, effectively.
Yes, yeah. When did sex outside marriage stop being a normal kind of stage of courtship? When did shame start to creep into that?
So really you need a 20th century historian. Yeah. I would say not in my period, and it would be, I think, probably the late 19th century. However, illegitimacy rates continued. So clearly lots of people were having sex before marriage. It's also really class specific. So the labouring poor, historians' kind of catch-all term for anybody lower than middle class. Totally normal part of courtship. For the middling sorts, and so kind of like tradesmen, merchants, professionals, lawyers, that kind of level, and above, so aristocrats and landowners, sex before marriage was always bad, because the risk of illegitimacy was so much more, and the importance of legitimacy. If you're inheriting land, being a faithful wife is incredibly important, and having a legitimate, provable, legitimate child is incredibly important. So they didn't take any risks, and they didn't, as far as we know, they may have, but hid it very well, have sex before marriage. And I think it's a kind of, in the Victorian period, there's this massive emphasis on the dangers of female sexuality and the fallen woman, and this demonization of sex work and the idealization of a very passive female wife and mother figure. And so I think it's a late Victorian cultural phenomenon. However, people have always had sex outside marriage. It's just to varying degrees of acceptability.
It's just something that people do.
It's human behavior. Yeah.
I think in this connection, it's quite interesting, some of the work that was done for the Fallen Woman exhibition at the Foundling Museum, of analysing some of the petitions from the mothers in the kind of 19th century period, because there is you know, the narratives that women are giving, you get a sense that shame is starting to creep in. So there's this sense that the narratives are being shaped towards being more acceptable. So there are descriptions of rapes and assaults, and there are descriptions of marriage being expected as a consequence. You know, but there are lots of kind of, there's a sense of that sort of slightly growing sense of shame around it. But certainly by the 20th century, we know from the oral history from some of the former pupils at the Foundling Hospital School, you know, they describe the stigma that went with their origins. By the mid 20th century, that was quite strong.
I think as well that, so I've also worked on mixed race illegitimate children, and kind of I've done a lot more about the impact of stigma that I didn't have today, but one thing that happens in the 19th century is you get the development of eugenics, and you get scientific change that emphasized inherited traits, and you start getting stigma applied in a much more pernicious way, because there's a belief that a child has inherited the immorality of their parent. And it's all to do with, and race is the same. Race is seen as a lot more concrete. A child will be like their parents and they can't get away from it. And that becomes a thing in illegitimacy stigma. Whereas in the 18th century, in the early 19th century, you know, Sarah Reed, and James Byrne, they are convinced that they are worthy and that they can be separated from their parents and they can do better, and that they have all this potential. And that was a really common way of viewing illegitimate children, that it was all about their upbringing rather than their birth. And I think when it becomes about birth, and it becomes about, you know, social Darwinism and all this idea about inheriting things, it becomes a lot harder to escape. And a child is seen as branded by that stigma, that they can never, it's inherent in their person and they can never get rid of it. And that is a 20th century thing, late 19th, early 20th century thing. So yeah, stigma was definitely got worse. Yeah.
Well, I think I'm going to wrap up there. Thank you very much indeed to our audience and to our speaker today. That was absolutely fascinating. I've been scribbling notes furiously throughout.
I'd like to say as well that if anybody, a lot of my work is published, but some of the articles are under a paywall. So if anybody wants to read any more, you are free to contact me and I will send you copies of articles and things if you wish.
Yeah, so presumably you can be Googled and found through your university. Yeah. Just for people who aren't so familiar with that. Fantastic. So next Wednesday at the same time, we have Dr. Claire Phillips, and she's going to be talking about medical care at the Foundling Hospital in the 18th century, so 1741 through to 1800. So I expect that's going to be similarly fascinating. But thank you very much indeed, Kate. That was fantastic.
Thanks.
Much appreciated. Yeah. And thank you to our audience for joining us. I do hope you enjoyed it. I will talk to Kate afterwards about a recording and see whether we're going to be able to share that more widely, and we'll let everybody who's a ticket holder know about that in due course. So, okay, well, thank you very much indeed. I will end our session. Thanks ever so much. Bye-bye.